The room shimmered with soft lights and low murmurs, glasses clinked, and wealthy guests hovered in tailored suits and silk gowns. Silas Vane stood tall behind the podium, the weight of the evening pressing into his suit collar, though he never showed it. The richest man in the room didn't need to announce his status. His silence was enough. His reputation had already arrived hours before he did. Tonight was supposed to be a formality, another expansion, another success, another headline. The new innovation campus in North Carolina was already being hailed as a revolution for coastal tech growth. The media waited near the back with their cameras ready. His board members watched proudly. His speechwriter had crafted a perfect narrative. Silas adjusted the microphone. He had just begun thanking the city for welcoming the campus initiative when a rustle by the door interrupted the cadence of the room. Heads turned. It wasn't loud, but it shifted something. Silas paused mid-sentence, eyes drawn to the main entrance. There, in the arch of the open doors, stood a woman, still, graceful, backlit by the amber glow of the hallway. For a moment he couldn't place the emotion running through him. The line he was about to say vanished. His grip on the microphone loosened slightly. She took one step forward. Naomi. No, that wasn't possible. He blinked once, but the truth didn't change. The curve of her jaw, the way her dress hugged her like she didn't care about impressing anyone. The softness of her presence. It was her, or someone wearing her face. Silas forgot where he was. His throat dried. He didn't hear the next question from the crowd. The printed speech in front of him might as well have been blank. He wasn't seeing a memory. He was seeing her, and she wasn't alone. 3 children walked in behind her, carrying bags of books, their steps quiet and unsure in a sea of onlookers. 1 girl, 2 boys, maybe 10 years old. Silas's eyes locked onto the boy in the middle, his stare sharp and reserved. The other 2, one had her chin high like a commander, the other lingered close to the woman's side, observant, cautious. But what stunned him wasn't their presence, it was their eyes, his eyes. The mic slipped from Silas's hand, bouncing once against the podium before it hit the stage floor with a dull thud. The room froze. All noise flattened. Every spotlight found him, not as a CEO, but as a man whose past had just walked through the front door holding his legacy. His hands trembled slightly. He clenched them at his sides. No one said a word. But everyone saw the truth written across his face. The man who had conquered industries was suddenly unsure how to stand. Silas didn't remember leaving the stage. He couldn't hear the murmurs or the click of cameras that followed his abrupt exit. The doors of the arts center seemed a mile away, and yet he reached them in seconds. The weight in his chest wasn't just shock, it was something else, something he hadn't felt in a decade. Regret. Outside, the breeze was cooler, quieter. The crowd noise from the gala dimmed into a low hum behind the glass doors, but what he saw ahead of him struck harder than any boardroom betrayal ever had. Naomi was helping a group of teens unload books from a cart. Her hands moved with care, her voice soft as she gave instructions to a younger volunteer. The Triplets were next to her, placing stacks of donated children's books into boxes for a library fundraiser. It was something so ordinary, so grounded, that it made Silas feel embarrassingly overdressed in his $8,000 tux. She hadn't seen him yet. Not the man who had once left unsigned divorce papers on her nightstand. Not the man who hadn't asked a single question. Not the man who had chosen silence over truth. He stepped closer, slow, unsure if he had the right to speak. Naomi looked up, sensing the shift in energy before she even turned her head. Their eyes met fully this time. There was no glass between them, no camera lights, no crowd buffering the truth. She didn't gasp, she didn't flinch, she didn't call his name. The twins stood back. Zeke watched cautiously, Lena's arms crossed with suspicion, and Ari narrowed his eyes in silent defense. Silas opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He wanted to say, "Why didn't you tell me?" He wanted to say, "Are they mine?" He wanted to say, "I'm sorry." But Naomi spoke first, not with tears, not with a scream. "You never asked for the truth." Silas staggered back a half step, the words sliced clean, not to wound, but to reveal. For 10 years he had convinced himself that he had been betrayed. For 10 years he buried the pain beneath empires. For 10 years he refused to revisit what he chose to destroy. The woman he once walked away from, and the 3 children who stared at him not with love, but with distance. Not one of them called him Dad. Not one smile. Not even recognition. Just eyes that mirrored his, guarded by the same walls he had spent his life hiding behind. And in that moment, Silas Vane, the man the world saw as untouchable, felt completely, profoundly small. The arts centre doors opened behind him. Guests began to spill out, curious. Phones discreetly raised. A few snapped photos. But no headline could explain what this was. This wasn't a scandal. It wasn't gossip. It was justice. Naomi didn't turn away. She didn't lecture him. She simply returned to helping her children sort the books, like nothing about his presence disrupted her peace. Silas remained frozen. Not by fear, by the realization that he hadn't just abandoned a wife, he'd abandoned a family, and now they were strangers. He didn't even recognize his own children. Not until they were standing 10 feet away, with the same eyes he saw in the mirror every morning, but colder, not just your reputation, but love, trust, family. She tried to stay, but he believed the lie, and when she left, she didn't leave with bitterness. She left with their children, and a heart full of secrets she never asked to carry alone. And when love is mistaken for weakness, if you know that real love isn't always perfect, but it's worth fighting for, please like this video, drop a comment below and subscribe. It helps YouTube push this story to more people who need these lessons, because what's coming next will change everything. This isn't a story about regret, it's a story about redemption. But for Silas Vane, redemption would come with a price no dollar could ever cover. Silas stood rooted to the pavement, watching Naomi and the triplets walk toward the library entrance. She didn't rush, she didn't falter. She didn't turn back to see if he followed. That dignity, calm, collected, struck him harder than anger ever could. He had prepared speeches that moved nations. He had led shareholders through crisis. He had negotiated mergers with opponents twice his age. But he had no script, none for this. He started forward, instinctively reaching out. Nah, he caught himself. That name belonged to a past he forfeited. Nina, he corrected, voice cracking. She stopped, not because of the name, but because the triplets halted beside her, forming an unconscious barrier between mother and stranger. Silas saw it clearly. They weren't intimidated. They were protective. The girl, Lena, stood in front, chin high, brows drawn in a silent challenge. Ari lingered behind her, hand steady on a box of books like he was ready to shield their mother if necessary. Zeke watched with a calculating stare, trying to understand the man he'd seen only on screens. Silas's throat tightened. He had led boardrooms filled with fierce competitors, but he had never faced 3 children who had every reason to hate him. I won't do this here. Not for cameras, not for gossip. She motioned to the triplets, and they continued up the steps. She cut him off gently. You signed away the right to ask. No anger. Just truth. Truth he had never bothered to seek. A reporter near the edge of the sidewalk lowered his phone, sensing a story bigger than stock prices. Guests from the gala whispered nearby, shocked that the poised CEO, who commanded rooms without effort, suddenly wore defeat on his face. For the first time in a decade, Silas didn't care who watched. He didn't chase after them. He didn't demand answers. He just stood there, alone under the warm glow of the Arts Centre lights, realizing the empire he built could not shield him from the consequences of a decision he made in ignorance. He could rebuild companies. He could rebuild fortunes. But could he rebuild trust? A limo driver stepped forward to open the door. Silas didn't move. He looked at his hands, steady in business, but trembling now. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. Awareness that he hadn't just lost a wife. He lost 10 years of birthdays, 10 years of first steps, 10 years of scraped knees and school plays, 10 years of voices calling someone else for support, 10 years of a life he could have shared if he had simply listened. The limo door shut quietly when the driver realized Silas wasn't leaving. He stayed there, staring at the building, knowing one truth: winning the world had cost him the only legacy that truly mattered. This is where our story begins, not with power, but with humility. To understand how Silas Vane reached this moment, we must return to the day his marriage was signed, not in love, but in strategy. The Varney family estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, had never felt like a home to Silas, not even in his childhood. The halls were silent unless filled with meetings or events. Conversations were rehearsed, and eye contact was used more to assert dominance than affection. Silas, at 27, was already considered a phenomenon on Wall Street. After transforming a modest tech firm into an industry giant in just 3 years, his board of directors praised him publicly and monitored him privately. Shareholder expectations weren't just high, they were merciless. But success had its own cost. In a late-night meeting that stretched past midnight, Silas sat across from his mother, Evelyn Vane, and 2 senior board advisors. The purpose? Optics. You're too powerful to remain. Unanchored, Evelyn said, swirling her glass of dry white wine. Unanchored? Silas lifted an eyebrow, voice flat. Young, unmarried, no emotional attachments. You're the perfect headline for a scandal, one board advisor added. The market needs a softer image of you, something relatable, a wife, a family. Silas stared at the room in disbelief. So I need a ring on my finger to keep the stock steady? Evelyn didn't flinch. You need to be palatable. Especially if you're courting legacy investors. Silas exhaled, leaning back. Names were floated, backgrounds discussed. Naomi Carter stood out, daughter of a respected Southern philanthropic family with deep community roots and public credibility. Her father had been a civil rights professor. Her grandmother, a celebrated educator. Naomi, a literature graduate, ran book programs for underfunded schools in Atlanta. She's clean, quiet, humble, one of the advisors said, like they were describing a brand, not a human being. Educated, Evelyn added. Silas didn't reply. It wasn't that Naomi offended him. He had glanced at her bio briefly, saw pictures of her smiling at book drives, children hugging her, city officials praising her work. She looked sincere, but sincerity had no place in his world. Still, he nodded once. If this is what's required, fine. A meeting was arranged. In Atlanta, Naomi sat across from her grandmother, sipping tea on their front porch, unaware that her name had just been selected for a marriage that had nothing to do with love. He's powerful, her grandmother warned when Naomi showed her the offer. Naomi smiled gently. But he needs someone real. Her grandmother gave her a long look. He doesn't need real, child. He needs you to fit. Naomi's mother hesitated but didn't object. For their family, the proposal meant security, respect, maybe even the platform to expand her outreach programs. And Naomi, soft-hearted yet curious, thought maybe, just maybe, this cold man in suits was just someone who'd never been truly loved. She said yes, but part of her whispered a prayer she would later regret not listening to. The wedding was held in Manhattan, at a historic cathedral repurposed into an event venue. Naomi arrived in an ivory gown stitched by hand from a local black-owned bridal shop back in Atlanta. Her hair was styled in soft curls, her makeup subtle. She held a bouquet of white calla lilies, her grandmother's favorite. Silas stood at the altar like a statue, tailored Armani, expression unreadable. The church was filled with people Naomi barely knew, billionaires, press, executives, political figures, a few celebrities. Her side of the pews held close family, mostly outnumbered and slightly overwhelmed. Cameras flashed, smiles were stiff, vows were short. I do, Silas said like he was authorizing a wire transfer. Naomi's voice trembled, but she smiled through it. I do. The kiss was a formality. The reception was grand. String quartets, curated menu, endless champagne. Naomi moved through it gracefully, exchanging pleasantries, dancing once with her father, and later walking alone toward Silas as he stood with his corporate circle. When she reached him, he offered her a small nod, no hand extended, no warmth. You looked appropriate, he said. Naomi held her breath. Thank you, she replied softly. The penthouse was colder than she expected. They arrived separately after the wedding. When Naomi stepped inside, she was met with white marble, glass walls, and minimalist decor. There were no photos, no books, no plants, just precision. Silas appeared a moment later, removing his cufflinks. I've arranged a schedule for public appearances, he said. You'll receive it from my assistant. Naomi looked up. And us? Silas paused. This is a partnership, not a passion project. Naomi nodded, blinking back the sting. May I decorate the library room? He didn't answer, just walked into his study and shut the door. That night, Naomi unpacked alone. She placed framed pictures of her family on a small shelf, set a worn Bible beside her bed, and cooked a simple southern dinner, cornbread, greens, and fried catfish. He didn't come out to eat, so she sat at the table by herself, whispered grace, and promised herself she'd try again tomorrow. Weeks passed. Naomi made small changes, nothing dramatic. She added throw pillows, kept fresh flowers in the hallway, stocked the kitchen with real food. She took morning walks around Central Park, volunteered at a local literacy program, and joined a neighborhood community group. She invited Silas once to a charity reading, He declined with a single word: busy. At corporate events, she stood by his side, smiled for the press, wore what the stylists prepared. She didn't speak out of turn. She didn't embarrass him. Her grace was effortless, but it didn't buy her peace. Behind the scenes, whispers grew. "She's sweet, but not one of us," murmured an executive's wife. "She's not corporate. She's just too soft." Naomi overheard enough to understand she wasn't welcome in Silas's empire, but the deeper hurt was that Silas never once defended her. He didn't correct the whispers. He didn't rebuke the gossip. He didn't ask if she was okay. At dinners he spoke only of quarterly reports and international meetings. She tried to share stories about the children she read to, the mother who cried during a book donation, the teenager who had memorized every poem by Langston Hughes. Silas barely looked up from his wine. One night, Naomi approached him after a gala. "Why do you let them talk about me like that?" He didn't blink. "I don't engage in petty politics." "I'm your wife, Silas." He tilted his head. "On paper." Her breath caught. "And what about in your heart?" "There's no room in my heart for distractions." He left the room. She stood there, silent, humiliated, yet still unwilling to hate him. She still believed he could change. The morning it all fell apart, Naomi was making ginger tea in the kitchen. It was one of the few things that grounded her. Silas had returned late the night before from a board retreat in the Hamptons. She hadn't asked questions. She didn't press. She had simply placed his dinner in the fridge, like she always did. But when she stepped into their shared bedroom after preparing his tea, she found a manila folder on her nightstand. Inside were divorce papers. No signature line, no note, no explanation, just his decision, quiet, absolute, and brutal. Naomi's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Terms were blank, dates were missing, but the message was clear: you are no longer necessary. She sat on the edge of the bed for hours, replaying everything. The way he avoided her gaze, the way he pulled further away each week, the late-night phone calls he took in his office, the cold responses, the things he didn't say. She thought it was just the pressure. She never considered he believed something unforgivable. A knock at the door startled her. It was Maria, the housekeeper. "There are reporters outside," she whispered. "They're saying something about you, about photos." Naomi felt her blood drain. She opened her laptop and typed in her name. The tabloid headline hit her like a punch. "Wife of CEO Silas Vane seen in intimate meeting with executive rival." The photo was grainy. The man was a friend from her literacy program. The hug had been after a reading event, completely innocent. She closed the laptop. It wasn't true, but Silas never asked. He just believed the worst. And now he had decided. Her grandmother arrived that evening. Naomi didn't explain. She didn't cry. She packed only what mattered: her journals, her faith, a few photos, a silver bracelet from her father. Silas wasn't home. She didn't leave a note either. She just walked away, with no settlement, no alimony, and a secret she hadn't discovered yet. Naomi didn't cry after finding the divorce papers. She didn't even scream. What startled her most was how numb she felt, like she had already been grieving long before that folder appeared on her nightstand. She had barely slept since. 3 days passed. Silas hadn't returned home. Not a call, not a message, not even a lawyer's contact. The silence was its own signature. It was Thursday afternoon when her phone rang. Private number. She almost didn't answer, but instinct made her slide her thumb across the screen. "Is this Mrs. Vane?" a voice said, male, older, with a sneer buried beneath formality. "Who's asking? You may want to be careful about where you're seen. Not everyone in your husband's circle takes kindly to distractions." Naomi sat upright. "Excuse me?" The line clicked off. She stared at the phone. Her hand tightened around it. Sweat gathered in her palms. A chill swept through her. 2 hours later, an envelope arrived at the penthouse. No stamp, no label. It was slipped under the door. Inside, 3 photographs of Naomi walking into the literacy center, and another, one she hadn't known was taken, of her hugging a friend from the non-profit, a gentle older man named Mr. Dansby, the same man used in the tabloid lie. She dropped the photos on the floor. Her grandmother, Mama Ruth, arrived that evening, bringing cornbread and her usual wisdom. Naomi tried to act normal, but Ruth noticed her shaking hands, the way her eyes kept darting to the door. "What's going on, baby?" Ruth asked gently. Naomi finally spoke. "They think I'm the liability." Ruth listened as Naomi shared everything: the cold marriage, the rumors, the envelope, and now the threats. Naomi stared at the ceiling. "But I haven't done anything wrong." Ruth placed a hand over hers. "You don't have to be guilty to be a target." There was a long pause. Then Ruth said the words Naomi had never expected to hear. "Leave. Quietly, while you still can." Naomi packed only the essentials: her journals, a framed photo of her grandmother, a set of earrings her father had given her as a child, a few outfits, and her faith. No designer bags, no jewelry, no keepsakes from the penthouse. She left behind the gowns, the shoes, the artifacts of a life that had never really been hers. She scribbled a single note to Maria, the housekeeper, and left it in the kitchen. "Please take care of the plants. Thank you for treating me like a person." Then she left before dawn. Mama Ruth had arranged a ride to the train station. Naomi wore a long coat and pulled a plain baseball cap over her curls. No makeup, no perfume, nothing that screamed CEO's wife, just a woman on the run from a life that looked perfect in photos but had left her soul in shreds. She boarded a southbound train with a prepaid ticket and no destination circled in red. All she knew was that she needed distance, from New York, from the cameras, from the silence that Silas had chosen over truth. On the train, Naomi chose a window seat. She watched the scenery blur: bridges, rivers, towns, the edges of cities. Every mile felt like a page turning, every stop a whisper of goodbye to the woman the world thought she was. She travelled for nearly 20 hours. By the time she reached the last stop, she had chosen a new name, not out of shame, out of survival. Nina Hart. Nina, simple, easy to blend in. Hart, because hers had been broken but not beyond repair. She registered at a small inn with cash, using her grandmother's old southern address for paperwork. No one questioned her. No one recognized her. The town was small, coastal, and humble. She was invisible, and for the first time in months, that felt like safety. The town didn't ask questions, it simply opened its arms. Nina found herself in a coastal stretch of North Carolina that felt like a soft exhale. Colorful shingle houses lined the streets, front porches were wide and welcoming, and the air carried the scent of salt and blooming gardenias. She checked into a small rental cottage with one bedroom, creaky wooden floors, and a chipped porch swing. The kitchen smelled like lemon oil. The windows let in soft light. There were no marble countertops or city skyline views, but for the first time, she didn't need them. It was quiet. It was enough. She found work within days at the local library. The manager, Miss Darlene, was a tall woman with silver locks and kind eyes who didn't press too hard. "You knew?" she asked as Nina filled out her temporary job form. "Yes," Nina replied with a cautious smile. "Just passing through." Miss Darlene nodded. "People pass through all the time, but the ones who stay, they usually do so for healing." Nina blinked. "I guess we'll see." Her days became routine. Mornings at the library shelving books, afternoons hosting read-alouds for children, evenings walking along the beach with a coffee in hand. She avoided mirrors for a while. Her reflection reminded her too much of who she used to be. But over time, her face softened. Lines formed, ones carved by peace, not pain. She helped local teens apply for scholarships. She taught free writing classes to single mothers. She joined Sunday services at a nearby chapel, not for attention but for the community. And slowly, the town began to call her their own. She was no longer Naomi Vane, the wife of a man who didn't believe her. She was Nina Hart, the woman who showed up. The one who helped. The one who smiled. The one who gave without expecting anything in return. And for the first time in a long while, she was beginning to believe she might be okay. At first, Nina assumed it was the stress, the nights she hadn't slept, the meals she skipped. But when it didn't pass, and her cravings began to shift, a quiet thought crept into her mind. She tried to brush it away. She wasn't ready to think about that possibility. Not yet. She bought a test from the pharmacy downtown. Cash, no questions. Back at the cottage, she stared at the small box for hours before opening it. The instructions were simple. The consequences, not so much. When the result appeared, she didn't scream, she didn't faint, she just sat, hand over her mouth, tears slipping down without warning. Her other hand pressed against her stomach as if to say, "You're not alone, not anymore." She was pregnant. Pregnant by a man who hadn't trusted her. A man who had chosen silence over truth. A man who didn't know that when he signed those papers, he walked away not just from a wife, but from 3 children, because her first scan just 2 weeks later didn't show one heartbeat, It showed 3, triplets. Nina Hart stared at the ultrasound in stunned silence. She traced the shapes with her eyes, tiny, perfect, growing. Fear knotted in her chest, but so did love. She hadn't expected this, but she wouldn't run from it. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. A child deserves a safe home before a grand one. And from that moment on, Nina Hart stopped surviving. She started building a life. The doctor's voice was calm, almost casual when she confirmed it. 3 healthy heartbeats. Naomi, now living as Nina Hart, clutched the sides of the exam table. Triplets? The ultrasound technician smiled. Surprising, right? But they look strong. Nina nodded, but her mind drifted. This wasn't just surprising. It was divine and terrifying at the same time. In the quiet of the rental cottage that night, she stared at the black and white scan, her fingers tracing the tiny shapes. Her chest swelled with awe and fear. She was alone. There was no husband to call, no family to rally around her, other than her grandmother. But she had made peace with that. The next morning, she sat with Mama Ruth on the porch of the small church-run clinic. The sun was just beginning to rise, brushing light across the water. 3, she whispered. Ruth nodded. 3 blessings, 3 assignments, 3 chances to raise what this world tries so hard to break. I don't have much, Nina confessed. No money, no title, no protection. You've got enough, her grandmother said, eyes steady. You've got faith, you've got sense, and you've got love. That's more than what some of these rich folks got raising one child. The months rolled forward. Nina worked until she couldn't anymore. The town gathered around her. Miss Darlene from the library brought books. The church community brought casseroles, fresh bread, second-hand baby clothes. The pastor's wife prayed over her belly every week. Local teens offered to help paint her nursery, a cozy converted room with 3 wooden cribs lined up in a row like soldiers waiting for orders. When the contractions started on a rainy morning in late summer, the whole street buzzed. One neighbor drove her to the hospital. 2 others stayed back to clean her home. Ruth sat by her bedside, humming softly. The labor was long, exhausting, but filled with prayer and strength. And then, just like that, Zeke was born. Then Lena. Then Ari. Nina sobbed as each baby was placed in her arms. Zeke, the eldest by a minute, stared at her like he had been here before. Lena, second, came out with fists clenched, voice loud, and eyes wide open. Ari, the quietest, wrapped his fingers around her thumb and didn't let go. Their cries filled the room like music. No father stood outside pacing, no cameras flashed in a hallway. But none of that mattered, because in that moment Nina knew. She hadn't lost everything. She had gained everything. Raising triplets wasn't easy, not emotionally, not physically, not financially. But it was sacred work. Nina learned early on how different they were. Even as toddlers, their personalities came through strong. Zeke was quiet but observant. While other kids threw toys or cried for snacks, he lined up his blocks by color, by height, by function. By age 4, he was solving puzzles made for 8-year-olds. He asked questions that stumped grown folks. He watched people, really watched, and rarely spoke unless he had something meaningful to say. Lena, on the other hand, was bold and vocal. She made friends instantly, stood up to bullies on the playground, and walked like the ground owed her something. She organized games, redirected tantrums, and once told a teacher that the class schedule was inefficient. She didn't just want to lead, she expected to. Ari was different still, sensitive still. He didn't cry often, but when he did, it meant something was truly wrong. He was most content sitting close to Nina, tracing his finger along her arm while she read. He didn't trust easily, but once he attached to someone, he held on tight. Ari had a way of reading the room, of sensing who was hurting even when they smiled. Mama Ruth once said, "They're all pieces of him." Nina didn't argue. Zeke had his sharp mind. Lena carried his drive. Ari held his distance. And yet, they were hers too. Zeke had her patience. Lena carried her compassion. Ari had her soul-deep silence that only broke for truth. One afternoon, when the kids were 7, Zeke sat on the porch and asked, "Mama, why don't we have a dad?" Nina had prepared for the question, but still, it pierced. She leaned beside him. "Some people leave before they understand what they're walking away from. That doesn't make them evil, it just means they didn't know how to love right at the time." He blinked slowly. "Does he know about us?" She hesitated. "No." Lena, listening from the window, said bluntly, "Good." Ari, sitting by the bookshelf, didn't say a word. But his eyes darkened. Nina prayed every night, not for a man to return, but for the strength to raise them to never depend on one. She knew one day they'd have to face the truth. But for now, she poured herself into shaping them into whole people, not in spite of their father's absence, but beyond it. Nina never returned to who she was, but she became someone even more powerful. She woke at 5, packed lunches for the kids, prayed over them as they slept, and ironed their uniforms with the precision of someone who knew the world would judge them twice as hard. At the library, she became more than just a worker. She became a mentor, a quiet warrior, a community lighthouse. When students struggled with essays, she offered feedback. When single mothers didn't know how to apply for government assistance, she helped them fill out the forms. She started a Saturday book circle called Chapters for Change, where kids from different backgrounds read together, learned together, cried together. She taught them not just how to write their names, but how to believe they mattered. Her supervisor, Miss Darlene, often said, "You don't just run programs, you revive people." The mayor invited Nina to join the town's youth council as an advisor. Local businesses donated supplies to her after-school initiatives. Church leaders asked her to speak on Women's Day about strength, sacrifice and love that expects nothing in return. Nina always declined the spotlight, but the town never forgot what she gave, and through it all, her triplets remained her anchor. They studied at the same library she worked in, helped stack books after closing, and followed her lead, not just in discipline, but in character. People often said the three of them were reflections of their mother. She smiled at that, because even if they carried the man's genes, it was her hands that shaped their roots. She raised them not just to survive, but to serve, not just to shine, but to stand, not just to question, but to seek wisdom in the answers. Mama Ruth had grown slower over the years. Her hands, once strong enough to carry groceries up 2 flights of stairs, now trembled while lifting a teacup. She still wore her same Sunday hats, still quoted scripture without opening a Bible, still hummed hymns when folding towels. But Nina knew time was narrowing. One evening, just after the triplets turned 9, Nina brought over dinner, okra stew, rice and cornbread. Ruth barely touched her plate. "You tired?" Nina asked. Ruth smiled faintly. "Just finishing my race." Nina sat beside her, the room dim except for the lamplight. "I'm scared," she admitted. Ruth's fingers touched hers. "Of what?" "That I'll never be able to tell them the whole truth." "About him," Ruth nodded. "Love doesn't hide, but truth waits for the right moment." Nina exhaled, eyes glassy. "And when is that? You'll know. When your voice shakes but your heart stands still." They sat in silence. Ruth reached into the drawer and handed her an envelope. Inside was a photo, Naomi on her wedding day, standing beside Ruth, glowing. "Don't erase her," Ruth said softly. "Let the kids know who she was, too." Nina smiled through tears. "I thought I had—" Ruth shook her head. "You built a new name. That's fine. But remember, child, Naomi wasn't weak. She was wounded. She walked away not because she broke, but because she wouldn't break for someone who didn't see her." Later that night, Ruth fell asleep in her chair. By morning she was gone, peacefully, quietly, with her hand resting on her Bible and a note tucked beside her. "Let your children know that strength doesn't shout, it shows up, and real love always circles back to the truth." Nina folded the note into her journal. That day she didn't go to work. She stayed home, let the kids be kids. And as they napped on the couch, arms tangled together like vines from the same root, she whispered to herself, "When the time comes, I'll tell them everything." But until then, she'd protect their peace, the way Ruth once protected hers. What had started with a tech empire now extended to aerospace, renewable energy, infrastructure, AI, and biotech. He'd acquired failing companies and turned them into empires. Forbes featured him 3 times a year. He didn't chase headlines. They arrived at his door like offerings. The world called him the first trillionaire of his generation, but success, as always, came at a cost. His residence changed from a penthouse in Manhattan to a high-security glass estate in Silicon Valley, complete with biometric gates and a private airstrip. The staff followed silent protocols. His assistants rotated every 6 months because they rarely lasted longer. His calendar was so tightly packed that his meals were sometimes delivered to him mid-call. He never noticed when they got cold. He still dined alone. He still woke alone. He still carried a name that meant everything on paper, but nothing when whispered in the dark. Silas never remarried. He had dated models, scientists, economists, even the daughter of a UN diplomat, but none stayed beyond a few weeks, not because they weren't impressive, but because they were all chasing an image of power, of access, of proximity to legacy, and Silas was chasing nothing. He told himself he preferred it that way. No risks, no attachments, no lies. But there were nights, rare ones, where he would wake in a cold sweat, reaching for someone who was no longer there. Naomi. Her name had become a forbidden echo in his life. He never said it out loud, never allowed it in conversation, but every time he saw a woman with her kindness, every time he passed a bookstore or heard laughter that resembled hers, something inside him would press pause. He didn't know where she went after the divorce, didn't care to ask, at least that's what he told himself. She had left, disappeared without a trace, and somewhere deep down, Silas believed she had taken the last piece of him that could ever feel like home. In the boardroom, projections flashed across a massive screen. Silas sat at the head of the table, silent, fingers steepled. His top advisor, Mitchell Sloan, clicked through the slides. This coastal region in North Carolina is prime for a new innovation campus, Mitchell explained. Tax incentives, educational partnerships, untapped engineering talent, and a community eager for investment. Another executive chimed in. There's an old textile plant nearby, perfect for conversion into a green tech facility, sustainable construction, massive workforce opportunities. The optics are excellent. Silas barely nodded. He rarely needed convincing when it came to growth. Numbers told their own story. Another slide appeared, showing aerial photos of the town. Forests, rivers, a close-knit downtown. Silas squinted at one of the images. Something felt familiar, but he brushed it off. This will be our coastal anchor for East Coast innovation, Mitchell said confidently. The governor's already showing interest. Silas stood slowly, buttoned his jacket. Make it happen. There was no discussion about the town's name, no personal recognition, no suspicion that fate had just taken his signature and drawn a perfect circle. Later that day, Silas reviewed a list of philanthropic initiatives tied to the new expansion. The board had suggested community outreach to soften their corporate image, scholarships, library programs, STEM grants. He didn't read past the bullet points. He approved the proposals with a single email. Fund it all. He didn't know that one of those proposals was for a local library, submitted by a woman named Nina Hart. He didn't know the triplets he'd never met were enrolled in that same library's youth programs. He didn't know that the place he had just chosen for corporate legacy was the town his real legacy already called home. The expansion paperwork came in stacks, each folder marked by legal teams and economic development partners. Silas signed them with the rhythm of muscle memory, eyes flicking over each clause, barely slowing to absorb the details. He didn't need to. This was routine. His life operated on autopilot. He scanned the infrastructure documents, digital blueprints, public-private partnerships, and site permits. A few letters of support had been enclosed, mostly from local figures, the mayor, school principal, and one from a community librarian. He didn't read them. His assistant highlighted the last folder. This one's about the gala, sir. The town's planning a public announcement ceremony at the Community Arts Center. They've invited you to speak. Silas arched a brow. Public, very controlled. Local media only. Feel-good coverage. Family-friendly setting. Think of it as narrative shaping. He said nothing for a moment, then nodded. Block 90 minutes. Understood. Behind him, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of a horizon stretched in gold. Below, a private car idled, ready to take him to a silent mansion. Silas signed the final document, sealing the fate of a town he hadn't stepped foot in yet. He closed the folder, didn't ask for details, didn't notice the last page. A community profile submission that read, Nina Hart, library coordinator, literacy advocate, youth mentor. If he had looked closer, maybe he would have caught the shape of her handwriting in the scanned letter. Maybe he would have recognized the way she used metaphors to teach children hope. Maybe he would have paused at the name Hart, but he didn't. He moved on, because that's what Silas Vane did. He moved forward, even when the past was quietly preparing its return. Nina read the letter 3 times. It was printed on heavy white stock, embossed with the town seal, signed by the mayor herself. They were planning a community gala to welcome a new investment partner, some global innovation firm. The mayor's note was warm and direct. You've been nominated by several community leaders to represent our library during the donor announcement. We'd be honored if you'd speak briefly and share the impact of our programs." Nina exhaled. She rarely accepted public invitations. She preferred to serve quietly behind the scenes, but the library had been struggling for years, underfunded, overlooked, holding its doors open on faith and second-hand books. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her planner. That evening, after dinner, she read the invitation aloud to the triplets. Zeke listened with interest, calculating the purpose. Lena immediately said, "You should go. They picked you for a reason." Ari looked uncertain. "Will there be cameras?" "Maybe," Nina said. "But it won't be about us. It'll be about the town." She expected more hesitation, but instead they rallied. Zeke helped her select passages from student essays to quote. Lena designed a small board with photos of community programs. Ari offered to help carry boxes of donated books to display. By the end of the week, Nina had agreed to attend. She didn't ask who the donor was. She didn't know. And when she walked into the community arts center that night, modestly dressed, curls pinned neatly, calm as always, she didn't realize that her decision to say yes would shatter a silence 10 years in the making. Because Silas Vane's plane had just landed, and he was minutes away from standing behind a podium, where her name would echo in a room that was about to stop breathing. Silas Vane's arrival at the Community Arts Center didn't come with flashing lights or a parade of security, though both had been offered. He declined the spectacle. He didn't need noise to announce his presence. He walked in with the stillness of someone used to having rooms stop when he entered. A charcoal grey suit hugged his frame, tailored with precision. His watch, one of 10 ever made, gleamed faintly under the center's vintage chandeliers. Every detail about him was calculated. From the angle of his silk pocket square to the polish on his Italian shoes, he embodied control. As he stepped into the lobby, murmurs began. Not loud, but instinctive. "That's him. Silas Vane. I didn't think he'd actually show." He offered a brief nod to the mayor, shook hands with the governor's liaison, and accepted a glass of mineral water with a distant smile. The event was dressed in small-town charm. White linen tablecloths, a jazz trio near the stage, hand-lettered signs on the display booths. But Silas had walked into grander galas than most people could imagine. To him, this was quaint. Still, something felt off. He couldn't place it. A tension tugged at the edge of his thoughts. He scanned the room casually, just habit, nothing more. The mayor began her welcome speech, praising his corporation's investment and pledging full support for the upcoming innovation campus. Guests clapped politely. Silas nodded at the appropriate moments. Yet he wasn't listening. Not really. His eyes drifted toward the back of the center where volunteers were organizing community tables. There were books on display, colorful signs about library literacy, children's drawings taped to folding boards. His gaze lingered. Something stirred beneath his polished exterior. He took a slow step forward, drawn not by curiosity, but by something deeper, and then he saw her. At first he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. She was bent slightly, arranging books in small stacks, her dress a soft earth tone, modest, elegant, not extravagant. Her hair, once worn in long curls, was now in a neat twist, highlighting the shape of her face, her cheekbones more defined. She was older, but so was he. Silas's chest tightened. She hadn't seen him yet. She moved with ease, greeting a young boy who pointed to a comic book, smiling at a teenage girl who held up a poster. Her presence radiated calm but not weakness, grace but not distance. She wasn't trying to be noticed. That only made her impossible to ignore. Naomi. He blinked, half believing it would break the illusion. But it didn't. She turned just slightly to greet a guest, and in that second he saw her face fully, not a memory, not a resemblance, her. Naomi Carter Vane, now standing 10 feet away, alive, whole and real. He forgot about the gala, the press, the governor, the millions that had brought him here. The only thing that existed now was the woman he hadn't seen in a decade. She hadn't changed everything, but she had evolved. Gone was the soft uncertainty she carried on their wedding day, the shy hesitation, the gentle efforts to warm a home he never welcomed. What stood before him now was a woman no longer trying to fit in, but rooted in her place, certain, grounded, and yet, as much as he studied her, Silas couldn't see anger. Not in her hands, not in her posture, no venom, just quiet strength. He tried to step forward, but something pulled him back. A voice deep inside, one he hadn't listened to in years, whispered, "She owes you nothing." He didn't know how long he stood there. It might have been seconds, might have been minutes. But in that stillness, the memory of her saying, "I'm your wife, Silas," echoed in his mind. And now, she wasn't. She had become something far beyond that, and somehow he already knew. He was no longer the one who got to define her. Just as he was about to walk over, 3 children stepped into his line of sight. A boy around 10 approached Naomi, holding a clipboard. His posture was focused, shoulders slightly tense, brow furrowed in thought. He pointed at the arrangement of books, and Naomi smiled before gently adjusting the display. The boy nodded once, satisfied, and moved back beside the others. There were 2 more. A girl with her hair braided back into 2 tight plaits, confident stance, arms crossed like a general inspecting a troop. She said something with sharp clarity, and the boy responded in the same tone. They disagreed briefly. Then the 3rd child, quieter than the other 2, offered a soft suggestion. The discussion ended peacefully. 3 of them. Silas watched them, frozen. His breath caught. The girl tilted her head just slightly, and he saw it, the way she squared her jaw. His mother's exact expression. The 2nd boy, the one who stood back, he had Silas's eyes, the same look he'd worn in boardrooms, in negotiations, in the mirror every morning. And the 1st boy, the one with the clipboard, had his silence, calculated, controlled, intentional. He didn't need a test. He didn't need someone to say it out loud. Every cell in his body already knew. They were his. They were his. He stumbled back 1 step. It wasn't possible. But it was. His heart pounded, not in fear, in recognition. These children, they were everything he never imagined missing, and somehow he had missed it all. First steps, first words, first days of school. He had missed a decade of moments, not because he'd been denied, but because he had never asked. Naomi, or Nina, as the town now knew her, finally noticed the shift in the room. Guests were whispering, phones were being subtly raised, people stepped aside, and saw him. Her breath didn't catch, her hands didn't tremble, she simply exhaled. It had always been a possibility, that he'd show up, that fate would stop hiding, that silence would end, but nothing prepared her for the actual weight of the moment. They locked eyes. He started toward her, steps unsure, unlike the man the world knew. When he reached her, he opened his mouth. Nothing came. The triplets noticed. They moved instinctively, stepping closer to their mother. Zeke, the eldest, narrowed his eyes at the stranger now standing too close. Silas noticed all of it. The protective instincts, the walls, the cold curiosity. He swallowed. "Naomi." She didn't flinch, but the name, it hit something raw inside her. He took another step forward, tone quieter. I didn't know." She looked at him, not with hate, not with tears. You never asked for the truth. The silence after that sentence was deafening. Guests stared. No one dared speak. Silas's lips parted, his eyes shimmered, but he couldn't speak. Because how do you explain that you once had everything? No drama, no shouting, just dignity. He turned to follow but stopped when Zeke looked over his shoulder, not with fear, not with softness, but with silent judgment, like he was deciding whether this man deserved to be called anything at all. And in that moment Silas Vane knew this wasn't a reunion, it was a reckoning, and the only way forward would be through everything he once chose to ignore. The gala had ended, but Silas didn't leave. He stood by the exit of the arts centre, waiting, not as a CEO, not as a trillionaire, but as a man holding on to the edge of something too big to name. The crowd had thinned. Most of the guests had either left or gathered outside in polite clusters, whispering about what they'd witnessed. Silas wasn't listening. His mind was still trapped in Naomi's words. You never asked for the truth. It wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it, without anger, without pain. Just fact. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't shamed him. But that made it worse. Naomi didn't demand to be seen. She simply was. When she emerged from the back hallway with the triplets by her side, Silas stepped forward. Not fast, not aggressively, carefully. "Now," she paused, "don't use that name." Silas's throat tightened. "I need to talk to you. Just you." Zeke's eyes narrowed. Lena crossed her arms. Ari gripped his mother's hand tighter. Naomi studied Silas for a long second, then looked at the kids. "Give us a moment. Stay close." The triplets didn't move far, but they gave her space. Silas waited until she was fully turned toward him. "I didn't know," he said, his voice strained. "No, you didn't," she cut in. "You never imagined because you never asked. You believed what you were told because it was easier than trusting me." Silas lowered his eyes. There were rumors, photographs. A board member said. "I know what they said," she interrupted again. "But you didn't come to me. You didn't ask me to explain. You handed me silence and called it closure." He looked at her, helpless. "I thought you ran." "I did run," she admitted. "Not from guilt, from danger, from betrayal." Silas stepped forward, desperation creeping into his voice. "Why didn't you come back? Tell me? Write? Anything?" Naomi's expression didn't soften. "You don't ask a woman to return to a house where her safety wasn't protected and her heart was dismissed." "I left for survival, Silas, not revenge." He had no reply, because deep down he knew she was right. The next morning, Silas showed up at the library just before opening. He didn't send an assistant. He didn't call ahead. He waited outside on the bench beside the community mural. Naomi arrived 20 minutes later. She didn't look surprised. "Again?" she asked quietly. He stood. "I'm not here to argue," she eyed him. "Then why are you here? I want to see them. Zeke, Lena, Ari." Her face didn't flinch, but her breath did catch slightly. "That's not your decision. They're my children. They're my children," she corrected. "You gave up your right to fatherhood the day you handed me those papers without a conversation." "I didn't know," he repeated. Naomi shook her head. "You chose not to know." He took a shaky breath. "Please, I'm not asking for everything, just a chance to talk to them." "They're not ready," she said. "They don't even know me." "They know enough," Naomi replied. "They watched you stand frozen when they appeared. They saw you reach for me like I owed you something. They saw how power struggles in you when you lose control." Silas stepped back. She wasn't angry, just resolute. Naomi glanced at her watch. "I have children to teach. Can I wait?" he asked. "Outside?" She hesitated. "You can wait," she said at last. "But don't expect them to come to you just because you're here." He sat back on the bench, tension rippling through him. An hour later, the triplets arrived with their backpacks slung over their shoulders. Naomi gestured toward the door. They followed. But Zeke stopped when he saw Silas. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. Lena glared. Ari, the quiet one, looked for a moment longer, and then walked away. It was dismissal, like they didn't know him. Because they didn't. Silas Vane, business legend, global icon, sat in silence as 3 children he helped create walked right past him. And for the first time in his adult life, he felt powerless. That night, Silas returned to his hotel suite and placed a call he hadn't made in years. "Reed." A voice on the other end answered with surprise. "Mr. Vane? I need a favor." Reed Dalton was a private investigator Silas had used back in his early startup years, someone who operated off the grid, discreetly and with brutal efficiency. If there were answers to be found, Reed would find them. "I want a deep investigation into a man named Carter Langston. He served on my board 10 years ago. Check all correspondence between him and my PR team from that year." "You're looking backward?" Reed asked, curious. Silas didn't explain. He hung up. By the next afternoon, Reed delivered a confidential file. Inside were email threads, unedited. Carter Langston had not only fabricated the photo that ignited Silas's suspicions, he had orchestrated the narrative, leaked it to tabloids, and suggested divorce behind closed doors to protect corporate image. Silas read every line. Disgust rose in his throat, not just at Carter, but at himself. He had believed a man who saw Naomi as a liability. He had listened to a board member and ignored his own wife. He had walked away from the only person who had never asked him for status, money, or reputation. Reed had also found one last item. Naomi had never touched a cent of the divorce proceedings. She took no settlement, made no legal claim to assets, filed no rebuttals. She simply disappeared. Silas leaned back in his chair. For 10 years he had blamed her. And she had protected the truth, raised their children, and asked for nothing. Shame settled over him like smoke. He was no longer just guilty of abandoning love. He'd abandoned truth, and now it was time to face it. The next morning Silas waited again, this time not outside the library, but near the back exit. He knew Naomi would take her break at noon, walking behind the building to sit under the old magnolia tree. She always sought shade. He remembered. When she arrived, she didn't look surprised to see him there. "I found out," he said quietly. Naomi tilted her head. Carter Langston lied. He framed you. He planted the photo. He told my PR team to run with it. Silas stepped closer. I believed him. And I never once gave you the decency of a question. Naomi sat down on the bench and crossed her arms. I didn't leave because you believed him, she said. I left because you didn't believe me. Silas sat slowly beside her, keeping a respectful distance. I don't expect forgiveness. You're not ready for it. I just want to understand how you survived. Naomi turned to him, her eyes calm but firm. I survived because I had to. I had 3 babies to feed. I had a reputation to rebuild. I had a name to bury and a future to create. I didn't have the luxury of anger. He lowered his head. Naomi continued, her voice low but steady. I didn't need your money, Silas. I needed your belief. I needed you to look at me, not as an accessory, not as a liability, but as a person who deserved to be asked. She stood. I built a life without your last name. I raised your children without your hand. I chose peace over proof. Silas stood too, slower. I see that now, he said. Naomi didn't move closer. I'm not here to open old wounds. I'm here to protect what I built. If you want to be part of their lives, you'll have to earn that from them, not from me. I will, he promised. Her eyes softened. For their sake, I hope that's true. She walked away, head high, steps strong. Silas remained under the magnolia tree, humbled. And for the first time in his life he understood. Power couldn't fix what pride had broken. But maybe, if he moved with patience, not entitlement, he could begin again. But as a father, Silas returned to his estate with the weight of 10 years pressing on him like a physical burden. The mansion, usually immaculate and awe-inspiring, felt hollow. The glass walls reflected his silhouette, but he didn't recognize the man staring back. He stood in his office, staring at framed awards, innovation prizes, humanitarian recognition, economic impact accolades. Each one represented a victory. But none represented love, none represented family, none represented belief. The silence inside his home was louder than the applause he once received. He walked through the halls slowly, passing photographs of himself shaking hands with world leaders, signing international partnerships, launching satellites. His public image had been built on extraordinary achievement, yet none of those frames held a child's smile. None showed Naomi. None captured moments that mattered beyond the headlines. He poured himself a glass of water, not scotch, not brandy, because he needed clarity, not escape. He sat in his father's old armchair, one he had inherited after his father's passing. The leather was still stiff, almost rigid, much like the man who once sat in it. His father had taught him rules. Strength means silence. Weakness is vulnerability. Family is duty, not affection. Trust is optional. Love is earned with sacrifice, not respect. Silas had followed those rules, and he saw where they led. He closed his eyes and recalled childhood dinners. Long tables, immaculate settings, conversations about market forecasts rather than emotions. His mother had been present physically, but absent in warmth. She lived in fear of stepping wrong, being criticized, or appearing imperfect. She didn't smile often. When she did, it never reached her eyes. As a boy, Silas learned not to ask why. He learned not to question, not to cry, not to speak about hurt. Emotion wasn't welcome. He remembered standing in his bedroom doorway, holding a drawing he made for his mother. She had glanced at it, nodded stiffly, and told him to tuck his shirt in before dinner. That moment taught him that affection wasn't earned through expression, but through compliance. When Naomi entered his life years later, she smiled easily. She hugged without hesitation. She talked about feelings like they weren't dangerous. She offered emotional safety he didn't know how to receive. He mistook openness for weakness. He misunderstood love as vulnerability. He learned his father's lessons too well. And now, he was trying to unlearn them. He sat in that armchair until sunrise, grappling with the truth. He had become the man his father raised, but he wanted to become the man his children needed. And to do that, he needed to face the raw truth. Success had never filled the emptiness left by emotional neglect. Wealth had never replaced family. Prestige had never replaced trust. Silas finally whispered words no one had heard from him before. I failed them. I failed her. Not as an excuse, as a confession. And confessions are where reckoning begins. 2 days later, Silas returned to the coastal town. Not with his team, not with security convoys. He came alone. He didn't step into meetings or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. He didn't announce his presence. He didn't ask to be recognized. He went to work quietly. He began by funding the town anonymously, discreet donations to the food pantry, checks to local schools delivered without a signature. Volunteer supplies dropped off before dawn outside the community center. He placed substantial grants into the library fund, routing them through third-party donors so his name wasn't attached. Naomi never knew, not at first. He attended a weekend beach cleanup event, wearing casual clothes rather than corporate attire. He picked up trash alongside retirees, teens and families. He didn't reveal who he was. He didn't correct assumptions that he was simply a newcomer trying to help. The mayor spotted him once and nodded. She didn't announce him. She simply handed him more gloves. He walked home covered in sand and sweat. It was unfamiliar. It was humbling. It was grounding. He helped repaint a playground after receiving a flyer from a group of parents. They assumed he was a visiting uncle or a contractor. He didn't correct them. He spent 6 hours repainting swings, slides, and benches with bright, cheerful colors. Later that week, he visited the community pantry and stocked shelves. One man recognized him, not as a celebrity, but as someone from the beach cleanup. "Didn't expect to see you again," the man said casually. Silas shrugged. "I had time." "You live nearby?" the man asked. "Not exactly," Silas replied. The man chuckled. "Well, we'll take the help either way. Folks here are kind, but they're tired. Every hand counts." Silas nodded. He didn't come for achievement. He came for understanding. And little by little the town noticed not his status, but his presence. After 2 weeks, rumors spread quietly. The new guy who helped paint the park, the tall volunteer who stocked soup cans, the man who donated school supplies. No one knew it was Silas Vane. That anonymity gave him freedom. He began attending library board meetings, not as a donor, but as a community listener. He offered suggestions when asked, stayed silent when not. He didn't demand attention. He began learning names. He began learning needs. He began learning humility. And slowly, he realized something. To build trust in a town that had unknowingly raised his children, he had to earn the right to stand in it, not as a leader, but as a student. Silas didn't approach the triplets directly at first. He saw them from a distance during school events, science fairs, basketball games, spelling bees, community reading nights. He noticed how they carried themselves. Ari sitting slightly apart, watching quietly, reading emotions before responding. Silas attended these events quietly, sitting in the back row or standing along the wall. He didn't want to appear intrusive. During a school talent show, he watched Lena take the stage and deliver a spoken-word performance about resilience. Her voice was steady, clear, powerful. The gym erupted in applause. Silas wiped away a tear he didn't expect. He attended a library reading night where Zeke led a workshop on critical thinking. His articulation and command surprised several parents. They whispered about his potential. Silas listened. Ari was the hardest to read. During a youth basketball game, he sat on the bench, not because he lacked ability, but because he didn't fight for attention. When he did play, his movements were precise and calculated. He passed the ball instead of taking the shot, reading the game rather than dominating it. Silas recognized himself in that restraint. One afternoon during a community recycling project, he was assigned to the same group as the triplets. They didn't realize who he was at first. Zeke nodded politely. Lena assessed him quickly with a skeptical look. Ari offered a cautious greeting. They worked in tense silence. When Silas struggled with tightening a bin lid, Zeke stepped forward and fixed it wordlessly. "Thanks," Silas said quietly. Zeke nodded once, but his eyes remained guarded. During cleanup breaks, parents chatted. Kids laughed. Silas stayed quiet. At the end of the day, Lena finally asked, "Why are you here?" Silas didn't lie. "Because I want to help." Zeke stared at him long and hard. "Most people help because they want applause." "I don't want applause," Silas said. "I want to learn." Ari's gaze softened slightly, but just as quickly his guard returned. Over the next several weeks, the town began recognizing Silas, not as a billionaire, but as a consistent helper. He sponsored a community science fair. He bought new uniforms for the youth choir. He funded the refurbishing of the library's children's section. He helped restore hurricane-damaged homes without taking credit. Parents noticed. Teachers nodded respectfully. Children waved. His presence no longer caused confusion, only quiet acceptance. But acceptance wasn't affection, and affection wasn't trust. At a pancake breakfast fundraiser, the mayor approached him discreetly. "I don't know your history with Nina," she said softly, "and I won't ask. But I will say this. Our town has seen philanthropists come and go. What they don't see often is consistency." Silas replied, "I'm not here for publicity." "I know," she said. "People talk. They've noticed you've never taken credit for a single donation." Silas looked down. "I've taken enough credit in my life." "Maybe," she said, "or maybe now you're learning balance." Meanwhile, the triplets observed everything. They saw him helping without being asked. They saw him listening before speaking. They saw him show patience. But they also saw their mother's caution. One night at dinner, Zeke asked Naomi, "Do you trust him?" Naomi took her time before answering. Naomi responded, "Trust is built on patterns, not promises." Lena said nothing, but her eyes reflected storm clouds, conflict between anger and curiosity. But the children remained at arm's length. They didn't sabotage his efforts. They didn't insult him. They didn't embrace him either. They kept their guard intact, a fortress built over 10 years. He didn't complain. He didn't demand. He didn't rush. He learned an uncomfortable but vital truth. Sincerity can open doors, but only love and patience can step through them. He was no longer a man trying to reclaim pride. He was a man trying to rebuild bridges that had never been built at all. And the reckoning was only beginning. Silas arrived at the library precisely at 8 in the morning, not in a suit, but in a simple button-down and rolled sleeves. He carried no entourage, no security, no assistant with a clipboard. The only thing he brought was a box of new books he ordered with his own credit card, not a corporate account. He hesitated at the front desk, expecting suspicion. Instead, Miss Darlene nodded toward the cart. "You're shelving in non-fiction today." She spoke to him like a volunteer. It grounded him. He pushed the cart slowly, scanning call numbers the way she had taught him last week. He didn't rush. He made mistakes, corrected them, and started again. At 10, the doors opened to students. Parents came with toddlers. Elderly patrons arrived for newspapers. Teens wandered in for computer access. The library breathed with life. And then Ari appeared. He didn't approach immediately. He stood by the bulletin board observing. "Why are you really here?" he asked quietly. Silas turned, meeting his gaze without towering over him. "I'm here to help. You can help anywhere," Ari countered. "So why here?" Silas thought before answering. His voice didn't shake, it softened. "Because you and your siblings grew up in this library. Because your mother built programs here. Because this place mattered when I didn't. I want to support it, not with money, but with time." Ari crossed his arms. "You already have money." "Yes," Silas said. "And I've learned it doesn't replace presence." Ari studied him, really studied. Then he asked, "Do you read?" "Not enough," Silas admitted. "I used to read contracts, reports, briefings. I stopped reading stories. My mother considered them a distraction." Ari frowned. "That's sad." "It is," Silas agreed. Ari moved closer. "What's your favorite book now?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but if you want, you can help me find one." Ari blinked, caught off guard by humility instead of ego. "Maybe," he said. "Not yes, but not no." Later, during reading hour, Ari sat 2 tables away while Silas helped stack returned books. Their eyes met occasionally. Something shifted. Not trust, not forgiveness, curiosity, the foundation of every bond. 2 days later, Naomi hosted a community dinner at the church hall. Not for charity, for connection. Families brought dishes. Kids served. Teens cleaned. Silas didn't sit at the head table. He stood in the kitchen, wearing an apron. Zeke followed him in. "You don't cook," Zeke said flatly. "I didn't," Silas replied. "I'm learning." Zeke watched skeptically as Silas attempted to chop vegetables. He cut too large, too uneven. Zeke sighed, took the knife, and demonstrated proper technique. "You're holding it wrong." "I see." "No," Zeke corrected. "You aren't seeing, you're assuming. Loosen your wrist." Silas adjusted. Tried again. Improved slightly. Zeke nodded once, approval in his own reserved way. Silas paused. "I didn't," he said honestly. "I had chefs, staff, people who did the work for me. Maybe if I had learned earlier, I would have been more patient." Zeke didn't smile, but he didn't walk away. Later, Lena pulled Silas aside with a notebook. "I'm entering the state tech fair," she said. "It's for prototypes. I need help refining my design." She unfolded blueprints for a solar-powered desalination unit, a compact model designed to purify coastal water for underserved areas. Silas's eyes widened. not with pride but admiration. "This is brilliant," Lena shrugged. "I need someone who understands material costs, manufacturing, efficiency. I can't afford mistakes." He didn't rewrite her idea. He said, "Show me your thought process." She walked him through each step. Asked questions, not to challenge, but to understand. When she finished, he said only, "You're on the right path. If you want feedback, I can help. But this is your design, not mine. You're not trying to take credit. I used to take control. Now I want to support." Her expression softened. When the dinner started, they sat at different tables. Silas watched, not possessively, not desperately, from the doorway during library shifts, from across the hall during community dinners, from the bleachers during school events. She saw Silas stumble during volunteer work, laugh at his own mistakes, and take gentle correction from teenagers who didn't care who he was. She watched Zeke debate him on logic. She watched Lena challenge him intellectually. She watched Ari test him emotionally. What struck her wasn't his effort. It was his restraint. Silas Vane, once a man who controlled entire industries, was now allowing 3 preteens to lead conversations, to correct him, to dismiss him, to question him, to ignore him. He didn't demand access, didn't flash wealth, didn't leverage influence. He learned routines, he learned humility, he learned names of teachers, of custodians, of local shop owners, of the librarian who had given Lena her first leadership role one afternoon. Naomi walked into the library and found him sitting cross-legged on the floor with a group of young students, while Ari explained the plot of a fantasy series. Silas listened attentively, eyes reflecting interest, not performance. A parent whispered beside her, "That man's here every week. Doesn't ask for recognition." Naomi didn't respond. She needed more than consistency. She needed clarity. That evening, she stood outside her porch while the triplets slept. The coastal wind carried distant conversations and traffic from the highway. She found herself remembering their home years ago. Large, cold, filled with luxury but lacking warmth. He never had. Not because he hated her, but because he didn't understand what love required. Now he was learning, but the question lingered, or something deeper. The next day, she approached him during library closing. "You're consistent," she said. Silas nodded. "I'm trying." She studied him. "Why now?" His answer was quiet. "Because I realized I had everything except purpose. Success filled my schedule, not my heart. I used to believe providing financially was enough, but I see now, presence is the real inheritance." Naomi's eyes softened, but caution remained. "Change takes more than gestures." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm not asking for forgiveness yet." She didn't walk away this time, but she didn't walk toward him either. She stood still. And sometimes stillness is progress. 3 weeks after his first library volunteer shift, Silas asked Naomi if he could speak to the triplets privately. Not at church, not at school, not in public. At the community garden, neutral ground. She agreed. He stood beneath the pergola, hands trembling, something he hadn't experienced since his earliest business pitch. The triplets arrived cautiously. Zeke stood tall. Lena crossed her arms. Ari kept his distance. Silas didn't kneel. He didn't posture. He stood equal. "I owe you 3 the truth," he began. "Not excuses. Truth. I wasn't there because I believed a lie. A man on my board told me your mother had betrayed me. I never questioned it. I reacted. I signed papers. I walked away." He exhaled, voice shaking. That was not strength. It was fear. The triplets exchanged glances. Silas continued. "I didn't look for you. I didn't ask questions. I buried the past, and because of that, I missed your first words, your first steps, your first days of school, your achievements, your struggles." His voice cracked. "I cannot ask you to erase that. You don't owe me forgiveness. You don't owe me a place in your lives. I'm not here as a CEO. I'm not here as a donor. I'm here as a man who failed and is trying to rebuild brick by brick." Silas felt moisture gather in his eyes. He didn't hide it. "I am sorry," he said, "not for what I lost, but for what I took from you." Silence hung. Then quietly, Ari spoke. "Not unless I'm asked to, and if I am asked, I'll respect it, but I won't disappear. I'll be here, consistently, without expectation." Zeke's jaw tightened. Lena bit her lip. Ari blinked back emotion. But for the first time they didn't walk away. They stood with him, not close, not far, just near enough. When they left, Silas remained in the garden alone. Not defeated, changed. Accountability had been spoken, tears had fallen, and the truth, finally, was no longer hidden. He understood something profound. Love is not given to the highest bidder. It is earned through consistent humility. And he wasn't done yet. But for the first time, he wasn't earning as a CEO, he was earning as a father. The living room was quiet, only the ticking clock and the soft hum of the heater filled the air. Naomi had cooked dinner, nothing fancy, just something warm and familiar. The triplets sat around the table, each in their own world. Lena poked at her mashed potatoes, Ari was halfway through his corn, and Zeke kept glancing between his siblings. Naomi cleared her throat and set down her glass. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me, okay?" They looked up. She continued gently, "How do you feel about your father trying to be around now?" Ari was the first to speak, his voice unsure. "He shows up. He listens now. He helped me find that astronomy book last week. I don't know. He doesn't feel like a stranger anymore." Lena scoffed. "He is a stranger. Showing up at the school library and pretending like we're some happy family. Where was he when you were working double shifts? When Zeke had the flu or when I couldn't afford my robotics kit? He wasn't there." Zeke shrugged. "I don't know what I feel. He talks to me different than the other grown-ups. But it's weird, like he's trying not to mess it up." Naomi nodded slowly. "You're all allowed to feel different things. You're not wrong, any of you." She looked at Lena. "Your anger is valid. You protected this family when you were just a kid. I'm proud of you." She turned to Ari. "Curiosity doesn't mean you're weak. It means you're open, and that takes strength too. And to Zeke, being neutral doesn't mean you don't care. Sometimes quiet is how we understand." She paused. "I've forgiven your father, not because what he did was okay, but because holding on to that pain was weighing me down. But that doesn't mean you have to rush. You'll each find your own peace. I'm here when you do." The silence afterward wasn't heavy, it was freeing, like a deep breath no one realized they needed. Lena was stormy all week. At school she avoided the library when she knew Silas volunteered. She skipped the tech fair, her favorite event of the year, because she heard he might be attending. Naomi didn't pressure her, but one night she knocked on her daughter's door and sat at the foot of her bed. "He asked about your robotics project," Naomi said quietly. Lena rolled over. "Tell him to build his own family out of spare parts." Naomi smiled sadly. "You've always been sharper than your years, but sweetheart, pain can turn into armor if we don't process it. He left us, Mom. He left me, Lena. You never gave him a chance to leave you because you never gave him room. You were just a baby." Lena didn't respond, but her eyes shimmered, and Naomi knew it was working. Meanwhile, Ari lingered near the library every day now. Silas would be shelving books, and Ari would pretend to look for something. One time, Silas pointed to a corner. "That astronomy section. Saw they got new volumes. Thought you might want to see." Ari mumbled thanks and walked away, but with the book in hand. At home, he confessed to Zeke, "He's not who I expected. I used to imagine this angry businessman, but he's just quiet, different." Zeke didn't offer an opinion, but he remembered how Silas had crouched next to him in the school hallway and helped him retie his shoelace when it came undone. "Your mom taught you that knot?" Silas had asked with a soft grin. Zeke nodded. "She did good," Silas had said. "Better than I ever could have." Zeke hadn't forgotten that. Naomi didn't expect to invite Silas inside. But when he showed up to drop off a book Ari had forgotten at the library, it started raining. And it didn't feel right to leave him outside. So she boiled water for tea. They sat in the small dining nook, no grand chandeliers or linen tablecloths, just chipped mugs and familiar walls. Silas glanced around. "It's smaller than I imagined, but it feels like home." Naomi raised a brow. "It is home. It raised 3 incredible children." He nodded. "I've rehearsed a million things I'd say if I ever saw you again," she admitted. "Some angry, some bitter, some broken." Silas looked up. "And now? None of that matters if it doesn't help us heal." His shoulders sagged. "I failed you." "Yes," she said calmly. "You did." He swallowed hard. "You left because you were afraid of your parents, of being tied down, of being less than what they expected. I understand that now. But understanding doesn't excuse it." Naomi softened. "That starts with honesty, Silas. Not money, not presents. Truth." He looked her in the eye. I'm not here as CEO Silas Vane. I'm just a man who finally realizes what he lost. And I'll earn every inch of space you're willing to give." She didn't say anything for a moment, but she didn't ask him to leave either. They sat on the porch 2 nights later. The rain had dried. The moon hung low, casting soft shadows across the yard where the kids had once played with handmade cardboard swords and glow sticks. "I don't know what comes next," he said, voice low. "I won't push. I won't try to rewrite the past." He looked at her. "Do you think you'll ever love me again?" She didn't flinch, didn't sigh, just looked up at the night sky for a moment before answering. "I still don't know if I love you," she said honestly. "That version of you, the man who ran, who forgot how to care, I buried him, for me, for the kids. But," he held his breath, "I see who you're trying to become, and that matters. That's a start." Silas blinked quickly. He didn't dare reach for her hand. Naomi stood. "You want to be in their lives. Show them consistency. Show them you're not going anywhere." She stepped inside. He stayed on the porch for a long time, not as punishment, but as reflection, and maybe, just maybe, as hope. The community centre buzzed with soft chatter and light music as guests took their seats. It wasn't the usual luxury gala crowd Silas Fontaine was used to. No tuxedos, no champagne flutes, just folding chairs, families, and hope. He adjusted the microphone as his eyes landed on Naomi seated quietly near the back. Lena beside her with her arms crossed, Zeke looking curious, and Ari watching everything like it might disappear if he blinked too long. Silas cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming today. I never imagined I'd be making this kind of announcement, not as a businessman, but as a father." The room hushed. He continued, voice steady but filled with emotion. "When I built Fontaine Tech, it was about changing the world through innovation. But for 10 years, I didn't realize the world that needed me most was right here, with them." He nodded gently toward his children. "I'm proud to announce the ALZ Foundation, named after Ari, Lena, and Zeke. This foundation will provide scholarships, technology education, and support for single mothers and underserved youth across Chicago." There was a collective pause in the room. Some clapped gently. Others looked moved. "I created wealth, yes, but I failed at creating legacy. This," he gestured toward the banner with the foundation's name, "is my attempt to begin again, not to erase the past, but to build a future worthy of the people I love most." The applause this time was fuller, more sincere. From the back, Naomi's lips pressed together. She hadn't agreed to anything, not yet. But this gesture, wasn't about showing off. It was the first time Silas used his power to lift others without centering himself. Lena glanced at the banner, her expression unreadable. Zeke leaned toward his mom. "Did he say, our names?" "Yes, baby," Naomi whispered, not taking her eyes off Silas. "He did." Silas stopped coming in tailored suits. He started showing up in hoodies and jeans, no driver, no assistant, just him. Sometimes he brought bagels for the kids at the library's youth coding class. Other times he helped carry paint cans for the local mural restoration project. And slowly, the triplets noticed. Zeke was the first to ease. He invited Silas to a weekend robotics meetup. Silas didn't just show up. He listened, asked questions, even took notes like he was the student. When Zeke's design stalled, Silas knelt beside him and simply said, "What if we looked at it upside down?" It worked. Zeke laughed. "You're better at this than I thought." Silas grinned. "I've had help from a brilliant 12-year-old. Ari stayed quiet most days, but when Silas joined Naomi and the kids for a volunteer day at the soup kitchen, it was Ari who asked the unexpected. "Why didn't you come looking for us?" Silas paused. "I did, for a long time, but I didn't know where to begin, and by the time I was ready, I was too ashamed." Ari nodded, not offering comfort but not walking away either. Progress. Lena held firm, arms crossed, eyes sharp, responses clipped. But when she caught him helping an elderly man load groceries into his car without knowing anyone was watching, no cameras, no speeches, she blinked. Was this the same man who once refused to hold her mother's hand in public? Naomi watched it all unfold without pressure. No nudges, no scripts, just space for the kids to decide. And slowly, the fortress they'd built around their hearts began to soften. The town square hadn't seen that much color in years. Local artists painted banners. Kids held up signs saying "Thank you, ALZ Foundation." The fountain had been repaired. Old folks sat on benches smiling. And in the center stage stood the triplets, nervous but proud. Silas stood behind them, hands folded, letting them take the lead. Ari spoke first. We didn't ask for our lives to change, but we've learned that change isn't always bad, just uncomfortable at first. Zeke followed. We're not here to make anyone a hero. We're here because this foundation means some other kid won't feel invisible like we did. Then it was Lena's turn. She stepped up to the mic, her voice stronger than anyone expected. When I was younger, I used to imagine what kind of man my dad was. In my mind, he was a mix of Captain America and someone who could bake chocolate chip cookies without burning them. Some laughter rippled through the crowd. I spent years being mad at him for not being real, but recently, I realized he didn't disappear because he didn't care. He disappeared because he thought he wasn't worthy. Silas looked down, breath catching. Lena's eyes met his. But people can grow. And today, she swallowed. I want to say something I never thought I would. Thank you, Dad. The word cracked in her throat, but she said it. Silas blinked fast, his hands trembling. He didn't rush forward. He didn't speak over her. He just whispered, "Thank you, Lena," so only she could hear. And in that moment, the crowd cheered, not for the billionaire, but for the bridge being rebuilt between a father and his children. The night had fallen, and most of the crowd had drifted home. The banner lights glowed gently, casting a quiet glow over the empty square. Naomi stood by the fountain with a small box in her hands. Silas walked over slowly, unsure if this was a goodbye or something else. Naomi didn't speak at first. She just held out the box. He opened it. Inside was a slightly faded wedding photo, the only one they had ever taken together, before the ceremony, before the disaster that followed. Naomi looked young, unsure. Silas looked distant. I found it tucked behind an old Bible in my grandmother's closet, Naomi said softly. I almost threw it out. Silas nodded, emotion swelling in his chest. Naomi met his eyes. This isn't a promise. This isn't a rewind. But it is a reminder. We built something once, and maybe, just maybe, it wasn't all for nothing. Silas stepped closer. Naomi, She raised a hand. Don't make promises, just show up. He nodded. She added quietly, this time, don't walk away. He held the box to his chest and whispered, never again. And for the first time in over a decade, they stood not as strangers or enemies, not even as lovers, but as two people willing to try again, brick by brick, memory by memory. The old town library had once smelled of dust and forgotten dreams. Naomi could still remember the creak of the wooden floors beneath her tiny shoes as a child, her hand clutched tightly by her grandmother, who believed every answer to life's problems was hidden in a book. Now, decades later, the same structure stood tall, restored with care, love, and intentionality. It wasn't just the chipped bricks that had been replaced, or the leaking roof that had been mended. It was the soul of the building that had been revived. The library's renovation was funded anonymously, until a small plaque near the entrance was unveiled a week before the wedding. The Margaret Elaine Brown Community Library. In honor of wisdom passed down and stories yet to be told, Naomi had stood in front of it silently, a hand pressed over her lips. Her grandmother's name, her legacy, her strength. It was Silas who had made it happen, quietly, not to impress anyone, just because he knew what it meant to Naomi. No interviews, no ribbon cutting, no press release, just dignity. Inside, the air now smelled of fresh paper, sun-warmed wood, and peace. Rows of new shelves lined the walls, but Margaret Brown's old favorite chair remained in a corner, reupholstered but still hers. Naomi had insisted on that. The triplets had each left something of their own inside, too. Zeke's poem tucked into a display case about community voices, Ari's sketches lining the children's section, and Lena's editorial about second chances framed beside a photograph of the town's elders. Everything about the place whispered home. There were no invitations printed on embossed stationery, no wedding planners, no makeup artists, just a handwritten notice on the library's corkboard, and word of mouth, Naomi and Silas will be saying vows at the library. Everyone welcome. People came, not for spectacle, but because they knew the story. Mrs. Randall, who ran the town bakery, brought peach cobbler. Pastor Jonah offered to officiate. The high school band showed up with their mismatched uniforms and rusty trumpet section, determined to play at last, even if they butchered it a little. No one minded. The triplets sat in the front row. Lena wore a sunflower yellow dress and tried not to cry. Ari wore slacks and sneakers, her camera slung around her neck, capturing raw moments between guests. Zeke, His head, now slightly taller than his mother's, held her hand tightly and whispered, "You sure you're ready for this?" Naomi nodded. "I'm not ready because it's perfect," she whispered back. "I'm ready because it's real." Silas wore no tuxedo, just a tailored grey suit and a boutonniere that Naomi had made from fresh lavender and a single pine sprig, symbolizing faith and growth. He hadn't slept much the night before, but this time it wasn't fear that kept him up. It was hope. When he walked into the library, no one stood for him. He didn't expect them to, but Zeke stood. Then Ari, then Lena. One by one, every seat lifted, until Silas found himself walking down the aisle of books and old wisdom, surrounded by people who had once seen him as a shadow, and now saw him as a man trying to step into light. Pastor Jonah didn't follow a script. He just smiled as he opened his Bible, glanced around the room and said, "Love doesn't always knock politely. Sometimes it crashes through the front door, messes everything up, and leaves you with a mess that only grace can clean up." Laughter filled the room. Naomi squeezed Silas's hand. When it was time for vows, neither read from cards. There were no memorized poems or rehearsed lines. Naomi simply looked at Silas and said, "I thought I had to choose between being strong and being with you. I didn't know I could be both." Silas swallowed the lump in his throat. "You didn't need saving, Naomi. I did." He paused, glancing at their children, then back at her. "And every time I walk toward you now, I'm walking toward who I want to be." The air stood still. Not a camera clicked. Not a whisper broke through. Until Lena quietly sniffled, and Ari reached across and wiped her sister's cheek without a word. Zeke let out a breath and whispered, "Finally." Naomi and Silas exchanged rings, crafted from repurposed gold. Silas had melted from the cufflinks his father gave him. It was a statement of shedding the past and shaping something new. They kissed, not like fairy tales, but like people who had been through storms and still found a way to smile beneath the clouds. The guests had gone. The music had faded. The triplets had gone home with Grandma and niece to give the couple some quiet. Silas and Naomi sat on the library steps, barefoot, sipping lemonade from plastic cups. The sky above was turning a soft shade of indigo. Naomi reached into her handbag and pulled out a small velvet box. Silas blinked. "You didn't have to get me anything. It's not new," she said, handing it to him. "But it's yours again." Inside was their original wedding photo, creased at the edges, the frame worn but intact. Naomi and Silas, a decade younger, smiling like fools. Not perfect, but pure. Silas held it like it was the most delicate thing in the world. "I used to think this picture was all we had," Naomi said softly. "A snapshot of what could have been. But now," she continued, "I see it differently. I see it as a seed, one we didn't know how to nurture before." Silas looked at her, eyes glinting under the porch light. "This time," Naomi said, her voice steady, "don't walk away." "I won't," he whispered, "no matter what, no matter what." They leaned into each other, the photo between them, their fingers brushing over the past and their hearts leaning toward the future. Somewhere down the street, laughter echoed from the town square. A bell rang softly from a bike passing by, and in that quiet, sacred moment, they were not CEO and ex-wife, not broken and mended, just two people who still believed in beginnings. Invite audience to like, comment their favorite scene, and thank them for watching.